Viking winter survival, homes and heat. Imagine this. Outside, the world has gone still. Snow falls in thick, silent sheets. The wind howls through frozen pines like a spirit denied entry. The sun, a memory, a rumor. 4 months now. Daylight has lasted only long enough to remind you what warmth feels like. And then it has gone again. This is Scandinavia in winter. Not just cold, but absolute. A cold so deep it seeps into bone, into breath, into dreams. And yet, people lived here, not just survived, they endured. They raised families, they told stories, they laughed in the dark. They did it inside the longhouse, the Viking answer to winter's endless siege. Not a home as we know it, not cozy in any modern sense. No insulation of foam or fiberglass, no central heating, no glass windows, no chimneys, just timber, turf, smoke, and bodies, packed together like kindling in a furnace meant to burn slow all winter long. The longhouse was more than shelter. It was a survival machine. Low to the ground, wide at the beam, built not for beauty, but for heat retention. If you lived near forests, it was timber, oak, pine, fir, hewn by axe and bound with rope. If you were farther north, where trees were scarce, you built from stone and turf, walls thick as a man is tall, roofs buried under layers of earth and grass. It wasn't pretty, but it worked inside. The heart of the house pulsed with flame, a long, open hearth running down the center, like a spine of fire. This wasn't just a place to cook. It was the engine, the source, the reason anyone stayed alive when outside temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there. No chimney? That's right. Chimneys hadn't caught on yet. Not here, not in this age. So the smoke didn't rise and vanish. It rose and stayed, curling along the rafters, staining the wooden beams black with centuries of soot, drifting down like a ghost that refused to leave. You didn't breathe fresh air in a Viking longhouse. You breathed used air, thick with wood smoke, animal breath, stew fumes, and the ever-present scent of wet wool. To us, it would feel suffocating. To them, normal, expected, even useful. That smoke helped preserve meat hanging from the ceiling. It kept insects away. It seasoned the food before it was cooked. And yes, it probably gave every Viking a cough that never quite went away. But if you had to choose between choking a little and freezing to death, well, you learned to live with the burn in your lungs. And around that fire, life. Raised sleeping platforms lined the walls, built of rough-hewn wood and stuffed with straw, moss, or dried heather. These weren't beds. They were thermal bunkers. Families slept side by side, layered in wool and furs, boots often still on their feet. Changing clothes at night, a luxury. In sub-zero conditions, even taking off your tunic could be deadly. So they slept in layers, always, and they weren't alone. Because the longhouse wasn't just for people, it was for animals too. In one end of the structure, separated by a low wall, more suggestion than barrier, was the byre. A sheltered store where goats, sheep, pigs, even cattle spent the winter nights. Not out of kindness, out of necessity. Animals generate heat. A single cow can radiate as much warmth as a small campfire. And in a land without furnaces, that warmth was currency, vital, shared. So yes, Vikings slept next to livestock, children nestled beside sheep. An ox might snore louder than Uncle Ragnar, whose might kick in the night. But if you woke up warm, you didn't complain. You adapted, you accepted the smell, the noise, the occasional hoof in the ribs, because that same beast kept your family from frostbite, kept the elderly breathing through the longest nights, protected the milk supply, protected everything. This was interdependence, not sentimentality, survival engineering, and the walls, packed tight with whatever nature provided, moss, mud, animal hair, scraps of hide. Anything fibrous, anything dense. These materials were shoved between logs or stones like primitive insulation. Not elegant, not clean, but effective. Every gap sealed, every draft minimized, windows rare. If they existed, they were tiny, covered in stretched animal bladder or thin translucent horn, barely letting in light, but stopping the wind. Glass was rare, expensive, and fragile. Why invite cold air when darkness was already your companion? And the roof, often thatched, sometimes layered with sod, literal dirt and grass, which acted like a giant thermal blanket. It shed snow, it held heat, and in spring, it might even sprout wildflowers, accidental rooftop gardens, or maybe just proof that life found a way, even on top of a smoky, crowded, animal-filled bunker. But perhaps the most vital element wasn't the structure itself, it was the people inside, huddled together, sharing body heat like a pack of wolves in a den. Parents wrapping children in cloaks, dogs curling at feet not as pets, but as living hot water bottles. Everyone breathing the same thick, smoky air, snoring, coughing, murmuring in Old Norse as the fire flickered low. There was no privacy, no silence, no comfort, by our standards, but there was warmth. And in the Viking world, warmth was everything. It meant you'd wake up tomorrow. It meant your food wouldn't freeze solid. It meant your tools wouldn't shatter. It meant your story would continue. The longhouse wasn't a palace. It wasn't sanitary. It wasn't quiet, but it was strong. It was smart. It was alive, a beating heart in the frozen dark. Built not with modern technology, but with ancient wisdom. That survival isn't about comfort. It's about community, about using every resource, every body, every scrap of nature to push back against the cold. So when you think of the Vikings, don't just picture them raiding. Picture them here, inside, huddled by firelight, surrounded by smoke and sheep, laughing despite it all. Because surviving winter wasn't just about enduring the cold, it was about refusing to let it win. And in that dim, flickering hall, with the wind screaming outside and the fire whispering inside, they won, night after night, winter after winter, until the sun finally returned, and with it, life. Viking clothing and layering strategies. Let's talk about winter. Not the kind where you zip up a jacket and complain about slush on your boots. We're talking about real winter, the kind that doesn't just bite, it devours. A cold so deep it turns breath to ice on your beard, freezes water in your cup before you can drink it, and makes even stepping outside feel like a dare from the gods. This was Scandinavia in the Viking Age, and if you were going to survive it, not as a warrior, not as a raider, but simply as a human trying to make it through another endless night, you needed more than courage. You needed armor, but not chainmail, not iron helmets or shields. You needed clothing, not for fashion, not for flair, but as your first and final line of defense against a world determined to freeze you solid. Because in the Viking world, what you wore wasn't style. It was survival, and their secret, layering. Not the modern idea of a base layer, mid-layer, outer shell. No, this was full body, head to toe, wool dash on dash, wool dash on dash, wool warfare against the cold. A system so effective, so brutally practical, that centuries later, we'd still be borrowing from it. So let's step inside, out of the wind, into the smoky warmth of the longhouse, and pull back the cloak on how Vikings dressed to live. First, the foundation. Every great fortress needs strong walls. Every Viking needed a good base layer. And here, two materials ruled, linen and wool. Linen was rare, soft, breathable, good at wicking sweat. If you had it, you were lucky, probably wealthy, or married to someone who traded with the South. But most people, they skipped linen altogether. Because when survival is on the line, comfort takes a backseat. Instead, they went straight to wool. Lots of it. Wool wasn't just fabric, it was life insurance. Unlike cotton, which soaks up moisture and turns icy in minutes, wool traps heat even when wet. It resists wind, it breathes, and best of all, Sheep were everywhere, so every household raised them, not for cuteness, not for milk, but for that thick, shaggy coat growing on their backs, the raw material of thermal resistance. Women and children spent hours spinning fleece into yarn, weaving cloth on upright looms, stitching garments by candlelight, and what emerged wasn't delicate. It was dense, heavy, itchy as sign, but it worked. Men wore tunics over trousers, often with leg wraps, strips of wool wound tightly around the calves, like ancient thermal leggings. These weren't just for warmth. They protected against snow, wind, and brush while walking. Women wore long, ankle-length woolen dresses, layered with aprons held up by decorative brooches, functional, yes, but also a sign of status, identity, and artistry. Belts kept everything in place, pouches hung from them, carrying knives, flint, food, maybe a piece of emergency cheese, because hunger was always one bad hunt away. Cloaks, essential. These weren't accessories. They were portable shelters, fastened with brooches, sometimes simple iron, sometimes ornate silver. Cloaks draped over the shoulders, like armor against the elements. Fur-lined versions were prized, bear, fox, wolf, whatever could trap heat. And if you didn't have a cloak, well, you probably didn't last long. Because without it, the cold didn't just seep in, it attacked. Now, move outward, to the outerwear, where function met ingenuity. Boots, for instance, weren't made in factories. They were crafted from animal hide, cattle, seal, reindeer, stitched together with sinew, then waterproofed. How? With fat, generous amounts of rendered animal fat rubbed into the leather, sealing every pore. It wasn't pretty. It stank like a jerky factory. But it worked. Your feet stayed dry. Wind couldn't penetrate. Snow slid right off. And for the truly dedicated, those facing blizzards or sea voyages, there was something even more extreme. Animal intestines, yes, cleaned, scraped, dried, and sewn into a kind of proto-raincoat. Imagine wrapping yourself in gut. It wasn't breathable. It crackled when you moved. It probably didn't win any awards for fashion, but it kept you dry. In a land where damp meant hypothermia, that was worth more than dignity. And no one dared mock your outfit when you were literally wearing someone else's insides. Respect was earned. Next, the details, the small things that made the difference between numb fingers and working hands. Between frostbite and survival. Hats, mittens, scarves, all standard issue, often made from felted wool beaten, soaked, and stomped until it lost its fibers and became a dense, windproof mat. Felt wasn't spun. It was punished into usefulness. Hats covered ears and necks. Mittens were roomy enough to fit multiple fingers. Better for heat retention than gloves. If you didn't own gloves, you tucked your hands into your cloak, hoping no one noticed your blue fingertips. Children wore smaller versions of adult clothes, same layers, same materials, because a cold kid was a weak kid. And weakness, in this world, was dangerous. Even hairstyles played a role. Long hair wasn't just cultural. It was insulation. Tied back, braided, tucked under hoods, it trapped warmth around the head, one of the body's biggest heat loss zones. And combs, made from bone or antler, found in nearly every grave. Grooming wasn't vanity. It was hygiene, lice, dirt, matted hair. These could lead to infection, discomfort, social exclusion. So yes, Vikings bathed, weekly, on Loggadog washing day, the origin of our word Saturday. They cared for their bodies, not for beauty, for readiness. Now, consider the logic behind it all. This wasn't random. It was a system. Each layer had a purpose. The inner layer, wick moisture. The middle, trap heat. The outer, block wind and water. And if one failed, there were backups, multiple garments, overlapping coverage, a tunic under a tunic, a cloak over a cloak, furs over wool, leather over hide. It was clothing as redundancy, because in winter, failure meant death. And yet, despite the bulk, the outfit allowed movement. Tunics were tailored, leg wraps bound securely, cloaks cut to allow arm motion. Form followed function, warmth followed form, and quality spoke volumes. Coarse, rough-spun wool meant you were poor, or practical. Fine, tightly woven fabric. That was luxury. The Viking equivalent of cashmere. Dyed wool, in blues, reds, greens, showed wealth. Imported dyes were expensive. Everyone else wore 37 shades of sheep, but even the rich didn't waste. Garments were patched, repaired, passed down. A good cloak could last generations, until it burned, blew away, or was buried with you, because even in death, you might need warmth. And finally, the mindset. Because clothing alone wasn't enough, you had to believe in it. You had to accept the itch, the smell, the weight. You had to sleep in your clothes every night. Because changing into pajamas in sub-zero temperatures, that was a one-way ticket to becoming a Viking popsicle. Boots sometimes stayed on, layers stayed on. You bundled infants in wool, placed children between adults like living thermal bricks. Couples slept close, yes, but so did cousins, neighbors, even livestock on the coldest nights. Modesty, a myth, warmth, sacred, and if your cloak caught fire near the hearth, too bad, you adapted, you replaced it, and you kept layering. Because the cold never stopped testing you. It came every year, relentless, unforgiving, but so were they. With every stitch, every seam, every scrap of wool pulled from a shivering sheep, they said, not today. This wasn't fashion. It was fortification, a wearable fortress, built not from steel, but from sweat, skill, and stubbornness. So the next time you wear a puffer jacket or zip up a parka, remember this. Before synthetic insulation, before Gore-Tex, before central heating, there were the Vikings, wrapped in wool, smelling of fat and guts, huddled in smoke-filled halls, but alive, still breathing, still laughing, because they knew a truth we've forgotten. Clothes don't just cover us. They keep us human when the world turns cold. It's the layers that save us, not just of fabric, but of culture, of community, of will. And in that quiet, smoky moment, when you're warm and fed and safe, take a breath and thank the sheep. Section 3. Viking Diet and Culinary Survival Tactics. Let me ask you something. When you think of survival, what comes to mind? A knife, a fire, a thick cloak against the wind, all good answers. But there's one thing that kept the Vikings alive through those endless, frozen months, something far more essential than steel or fur. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was food, not just any food. We're not talking about feasts with roasted boar and golden horns of meat, though yes, those happen too. No, this is about the real Viking diet, the one eaten in silence, by dim firelight, when the world outside was buried under snow and darkness. This was food as fuel, food as armor, food as insulation. Because in the heart of Scandinavian winter, calories weren't luxury. They were life, and if you didn't eat like your survival depended on it, well, you wouldn't survive. So let's step closer to the hearth, pull up a wooden bench. Feel the warmth on your face, faint, fleeting, but welcome. Tonight, we're not just eating, we're enduring, and every bite tells a story. First, meat, dairy, grain, and fish, lots and lots of preserved fish. That was the rhythm of the Viking kitchen. Nothing went to waste. Every scrap of animal, every drop of milk, every kernel of barley hardened, preserved, stretched. Because winter wasn't a season, it was a siege. And during a siege, you don't eat for pleasure. You eat to stay warm, to keep moving, to wake up tomorrow. So let's start with the most iconic and infamous of them all, lutefisk. Say the name aloud and watch grown warriors flinch. It's not a dish, it's a dare wrapped in rancid history. Whitefish, usually cod, soaked in lye, left to ferment until it turns translucent, gelatinous, and smells like something that died in regret. It doesn't taste good. It never did. But here's the thing. It doesn't spoil. Not even after months in a damp corner of the longhouse. So when spring felt like a myth and your stores were running low, lutefisk was there, glistening, awful, reliable, and yes, technically edible. The Vikings didn't invent gourmet cuisine. They invented survival cuisine, and lutefisk, that was peak adaptation, smoked, salted, dried, fermented. If it could last the winter, it ended up in the pot. Fish wasn't just food. It was currency. It was trade. It was stored in barrels, hung from rafters, tucked into every nook. And when it came time to eat, it joined the stew. Ah, the stew. The beating heart of the Viking winter menu. No recipes, no measurements. Just whatever hadn't rotted, frozen, or been stolen by the dog. A hunk of mutton, a few turnips, some sour milk curds, maybe oats if you were lucky. Toss it all into a cauldron over the central hearth. Let it simmer 4 hours, days, even. The longer it cooked, the better. Thickened by time, infused with smoke, sticky enough to cling to your ribs, and possibly the bowl. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't delicate, but it was dense, calorie-rich, warm, and above all, communal. Everyone ate from the same pot. Spoons were carved from wood or bone. Knives were used sparingly. Fingers did most of the work. And if someone dropped their portion in the dirt, too bad, shake it off. Eat it anyway. Cleanliness was a luxury. Fullness was everything. Now shift focus from the pot to the pantry, where the real treasures were kept. Dairy, not sweet cream or soft cheese. This wasn't a modern deli. This was survival dairy. Hard wheels of salted cheese, aged 4 months, so dry they could double as doorstops. Butters hardened into bricks, wrapped in bark, stored in cool pits. Skyer, that tangy, thick, almost rubbery fermented dairy, somewhere between yogurt and cheese, beloved, feared, and absolutely vital, high in protein, packed with fat. Sour enough to make your eyes water, but it kept you strong, and in a world where malnutrition meant weakness, and weakness meant death, Skyer was liquid resilience. They drank it, they ate it with bread, they traded it. Some say a good batch of Skyer was worth more than silver, maybe an exaggeration, but only a little, because without dairy, the winter would have broken them. Cows, goats, sheep, they weren't just livestock. They were walking pantries, milk in summer, cheese in winter, and bones boiled down for marrow soup when times got truly desperate. Every part of the animal had purpose, even the stomach, cleaned, filled with milk, and hung near the fire to make rennet 4 cheese. Nothing wasted. Nothing taken for granted. Next, grain. The backbone of endurance, barley, rye, oats, stored in bulk, dried, protected from mice and moisture. These weren't fancy grains, no fluffy loaves, no buttered toast. Viking bread was dense, dark, heavy as a brick, and sometimes made with tree bark. Yes, when flour ran low, and it often did, they'd grind up inner bark, mix it with what little grain remained, and bake flatbreads over hot stones. It wasn't tasty. It wasn't soft. But it burned slowly in the gut, provided steady energy, and kept blood sugar from crashing in the cold. Think of it as ancient slow-release fuel. Not delicious, but effective. Porridge was another staple. Oats boiled in water or milk, stirred constantly to avoid burning. Sometimes flavored with honey, if you had it, or berries, if you remembered to pick them in autumn. Otherwise, plain, hot, filling, and served in wooden bowls that rarely saw soap. Washing wasn't frequent, but hunger, always present, so they ate, again and again, because the body demanded it. Cold burns calories fast, and if you didn't replace them, you'd start burning muscle, then fat, then hope, so they ate. Even when they weren't hungry. Especially when they weren't hungry. Because skipping a meal in winter wasn't fasting. It was surrender. Now, pour a drink. Because no Viking winter table was complete without alcohol. Not just for celebration, not just for ritual, but for medicine. For warmth, for forgetting. Ale was brewed year-round. Mead, honey wine, reserved for special occasions. Though in wealthier homes, it flowed more freely. Both were high in calories, mildly antiseptic, and deeply comforting when your toes had gone numb and the wind screamed like a frost giant at the door. Mead especially. One sip, and suddenly the smoke in your eyes didn't stink. The goat snoring beside you didn't smell. The thought of another month of darkness. Almost bearable, and if it tasted terrible, even better. No one would steal your cup. Alcohol wasn't just a drink. It was a coping mechanism, a social lubricant, a way to blur the edges of hardship. They drank it during Ulay, the midwinter festival. They drank it while telling sagas. They drank it to stay awake during long nights of storytelling. And yes, they drank it to fall asleep faster, because sleep was sacred. And anything that helped you reach it was holy. Finally, consider the mindset behind it all. Because the Viking diet wasn't about flavor. It wasn't about variety. It was about efficiency. Every meal was calculated, not by grams or macros, but by instinct, by necessity, by generations of people who knew, deep in their bones, that winter was coming, and it would be brutal, so they prepared. They smoked, they salted, they dried, they fermented. They stored food in underground cellars, in clay pots, in wooden chests lined with moss. They guarded their stores like treasure, because they were treasure. A single wheel of cheese could feed a family for weeks. A barrel of fish might mean the difference between life and starvation. And when spring finally returned, there was no celebration quite like emptying the last of the winter stores, eating fresh greens, drinking clean water, laughing because you'd made it, again, so the next time you open your fridge, stocked, glowing, humming with cold air. Remember this. Before supermarkets, before freezers, before delivery apps and midnight snacks, there were the Vikings, eating lutefisk by firelight, stirring stews that smelled like wet wool and regret, chewing skyr that clung to their teeth, drinking ale that warmed their chest more than their soul. They didn't eat for joy, they ate for survival. And in doing so, they turned food into a weapon, against cold, against hunger, against despair. Because in the end, it wasn't just fire or fur that saved them. It was the quiet, daily act of sitting down and eating, even when they didn't want to, especially when they didn't want to. Because to eat was to endure was to live. And to live, that was victory. Section 4. Community, mindset, and cultural resilience among Vikings. There's a moment, deep in the Scandinavian winter, when the world goes silent. Not peaceful, not calm, but heavy, the kind of silence that presses on your chest. When the sun hasn't risen for weeks, when the snow has buried every path, when even the wind seems too tired to howl, and in that stillness, something stirs. Not fear, not despair, but endurance, because survival isn't just about fire, food, or fur. It's about what happens inside the mind when the darkness stretches longer than memory. And no people understood this better than the Vikings. They didn't just survive the cold. They survived the long night, the endless days without light, the suffocating weight of isolation, the creeping dread that spring might never come. And their greatest weapon, not swords, not ships, not even wool. It was community, and the unshakable mindset that came with it. Let's begin where most stories end. Inside the longhouse, smoke hangs thick in the air. The rafters are black with soot. A cow snores in the corner. Children huddle under furs. An elder stirs a pot of stew while someone else mends a tunic by firelight. This isn't comfort. This is communal survival. Every person here is a source of warmth, not just physical, but emotional. They sleep side by side, not out of affection, but because body heat is currency. A child tucked between parents isn't being coddled, they're being insulated, and when the fire dips low and the cold creeps in from the edges, they don't panic, they huddle closer. This wasn't weakness, it was strategy. A human thermal battery, charged by breath, fueled by proximity. No one slept alone. No one faced the dark alone. Because in the Viking world, you were only as warm as the person next to you. And that simple truth forged a culture built on interdependence, family, kin, neighbors, all bound together, not by law, not by force, but by the quiet understanding that if one of you failed, the rest would suffer. So they shared food, they shared firewood, they shared grief. And yes, they shared lice, snoring, and the occasional hoof in the ribs from a restless goat. But they also shared laughter, yes, laughter. In a world so harsh, so unforgiving, the Vikings didn't just endure with grit. They endured with humor, dark, biting, sarcastic humor. The kind that cuts through despair like a knife. They mocked each other relentlessly, joked about frostbite, bad haircuts, the cousin who fell into the latrine last week. Because in the longhouse, a good insult was worth its weight in mead. And storytelling, that was survival, not entertainment. Sagas weren't told to pass the time. They were weapons against madness. Epic tales of gods and giants, heroes and monsters, betrayal and revenge. Thor wrestling a cat that turned out to be the Midgard serpent. Odin trading an eye for wisdom. Loki getting exactly what he deserved. These weren't just myths, they were lessons on courage, on fate, on enduring suffering with dignity, or at least with style. And when the night stretched on, and the walls seemed to close in, someone would stand, raise a horn of ale, and say, "Let me tell you what happened when I sailed east." And just like that, the darkness receded, not because the fire grew brighter, but because the mind had somewhere else to go. Now, imagine midwinter, the shortest day, the longest night, when the sun hides and the cold feels personal. This wasn't a time for sorrow. It was time for Ule, the great midwinter festival, not a holiday, a lifeline. 4 days, sometimes weeks, the Vikings feasted. They sacrificed animals, not just for food, but as offerings to the gods. They lit massive fires, roaring bonfires that defied the night, daring the cold to come closer. They drank, they sang, they played games. Board games like Nefertaf, where cunning beat brute strength, dice games, riddles, wrestling matches that occasionally knocked over the livestock. And the Ule log, a massive tree trunk burned slowly, symbolizing continuity, hope, the promise that light would return. This wasn't celebration for celebration's sake. It was psychological warfare against boredom, against depression, against the slow erosion of the soul. Because the Vikings knew something we've forgotten: you can't survive winter on calories alone. You need meaning, you need ritual, you need to believe, even if just for a few nights, that you're not just waiting for spring. You're calling it. And so, around the fire, with mead in hand and stories on their tongues, they did. They laughed in the face of the freeze. They toasted ancestors who'd done the same. They reminded each other, we've made it this far, we'll make it further. But perhaps the most powerful part of their resilience wasn't what they did. It was what they believed. The Viking mindset wasn't built on optimism. It wasn't blind faith. It was built on acceptance. Winter wasn't an emergency. It wasn't a tragedy. It was part of the calendar. Like planting, like raiding, like harvest. They didn't curse the cold. They prepared for it. They expected hardship. They welcomed it, even because in Norse mythology, the world itself was born from ice and fire. And the final battle, Ragnarok, would begin with Fimbulwinter, an endless winter lasting 3 seasons, no spring, no relief, just cold, war, and the end of all things. If your religion includes an apocalyptic freeze as a central prophecy, well, a little snow isn't going to ruin your day. This worldview shaped everything. Weakness wasn't punished. It was simply irrelevant. No one admired a man who complained about the cold. Strength wasn't measured by how much you could lift. It was measured by how long you could endure. Children learned early. If your fingers were numb, use your elbows. If your toes were frozen, walk faster. If you fell through the ice and lived, congratulations. Now you have a story, and in that story, survival. Not victimhood, triumph. This wasn't toxic positivity. It was pragmatic toughness, a culture that said, the world is hard. So be harder, not with rage, not with cruelty, but with quiet, relentless persistence. And finally, the most overlooked ingredient, purpose. The Vikings didn't sit around waiting for winter to end. They used it. While the ground was frozen and the seas impassable, they repaired tools, sharpened blades, wove cloth, carved wood, made combs from antler. Women spun wool into thread. Men practiced sword forms in the snow. Children trained in archery. Stories were passed down. Songs were composed. Even leadership was tested. Chieftains weren't just warriors. They were providers, organizers. They ensured firewood was stacked, food was rationed, disputes were settled before they turned bloody. Because in winter, a single fight could fracture the entire settlement. And if morale dropped low, everyone suffered, so they led not with fear, but with fairness, with presence, with a mug of ale shared at the right moment. Because they understood, survival isn't individual, it's collective. And the strongest thing in a Viking longhouse wasn't the timber, wasn't the fire. It was the unspoken pact between everyone inside. We endure together. No one left behind, no one abandoned. Even in the darkest hour, especially in the darkest hour, they held fast. To each other, to tradition, to the belief that warmth wasn't just something you found. It was something you created, with your hands, with your voice, with your stubborn refusal to let the cold win. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by stress, by isolation, by the weight of the world, remember the Vikings, not the ones on dragon-proud ships, but the ones huddled in smoke-filled halls, laughing through chapped lips, telling stories in the dark, refusing to be broken. Because they knew the truth. You don't survive winter by escaping it. You survive it by facing it, together. Section 5, Sauna Culture and Intentional Cold Exposure. There is a moment, deep in the heart of a Scandinavian winter, when the cold stops being an enemy and becomes a challenge, not something to flee, but to face, to master, to invite. And for the Vikings, that moment came not in battle, not on the longship, but in the quiet, smoky heat of a small stone hut buried beneath snow and turf. This was the Badstofa, the Viking sauna, a place where fire met frost, where sweat streamed down beards, and where men, women, even children would willingly step into blistering steam, only to run barefoot into the snow, roll in ice, and laugh as if they'd just conquered death itself. Because this wasn't just about warmth, it was about ritual, about resilience, about proving, over and over again, that the body could endure what the mind feared. So let us step inside. Let the door close behind us. Feel the heat rise, breathe deep, and discover how the Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they played with it. Long before modern spas, before infrared panels and luxury robes, the Vikings built their saunas from stone, wood, and earth. Low, dome-shaped structures tucked into the side of hills or nestled beside longhouses. These were not places of leisure. They were sweat lodges, functional, communal, and sacred. Inside, a pile of rocks sat at the center, heated 4 hours by a roaring fire until they glowed like embers from the forge of the gods. Once hot enough, the fire was removed, the door sealed, and water, carefully carried from wells or melted snow, was poured over the stones. Hiss, Steam exploded into the air, thick, wet, smothering. The temperature soared. In minutes, the room became a living oven, men stripped to their waists, women wrapped in linen, children huddled close, and they sat for 10 minutes, 20, sometimes longer, breathing through the heat, sweating out salt, tension, and weeks of unwashed wool. This wasn't comfort, it was cleansing, not just of the body, though yes, in a world without daily showers, sweating out grime was essential. No, this was purification. Of blood, of spirit, of memory. They believed the steam opened the pores, not just to dirt, but to illness, bad luck, even sorrow. And when you emerged, drenched, dizzy, blinking in the twilight, you weren't just cleaner. You were renewed, but the ritual wasn't over. Oh no. Because what came next defied all logic. What came next was the true test. They ran, out of the steaming hut, into the frozen night, barefoot, half-naked, gasping as the Arctic air clawed at their sweat-slick skin. Some plunged into icy rivers, others rolled in snow. A few simply stood there, trembling, laughing, cursing in Old Norse, as their bodies screamed in protest. Why? Because they chose to. Because in the Viking worldview, strength wasn't just measured by how much you could lift, or how far you could row. It was measured by what you could endure. And nothing hardened a man or woman faster than the shock of extreme contrast, hot, then cold, fire, then ice, comfort, then pain. And back again. This was intentional suffering, voluntary hardship, a way to train the body and steel the mind against the inevitable grip of winter. Modern science now calls it thermal stress adaptation. The Vikings called it being awake. When you expose Section 7. The evolution of ancient mapping. Close your eyes. Now imagine this. You wake in a world without maps. No GPS, no compass, no satellite spinning above the clouds. Just you, the horizon, and the vast, unknowable expanse between where you are and everywhere else. How do you find your way? How do you know what lies beyond the next mountain? Beyond the forest, across the sea? For most of human history, that was reality. And yet, we did find our way, not by luck, not by chance, but by mapping, not with ink and paper, not with algorithms, but with memory, with myth, with stone, bone, stars, and stories. Because long before we could draw the world, we had to imagine it. And so began one of humanity's oldest, most profound acts, the creation of maps. Not just as tools, but as survival, as belief, as a way to say, I am here, this is my world, and I will not be lost. Let us begin at the very edge of time, in the flickering firelight of the Upper Paleolithic, over 14,000 years ago. On a fragment of mammoth ivory, someone etches lines, curves, dots, animals, a cluster of huts. Is it art, or is it something deeper? Archaeologists believe it may be the oldest known map, not drawn on parchment. Carved into bone, a record of movement, of space, of home. These early markings weren't about precision. They were about meaning, where the river bends, where the reindeer cross, where the tribe gathers. This was mapping born from necessity, from memory, from the instinct to make sense of a world too big to hold in the mind. And across continents, in caves and on stones, similar carvings appear. Not maps as we know them, but mental landscapes, frozen in time. A prehistoric declaration. This is where we are. This is how we survive. Fast forward to the cradle of civilization. To the dust-choked plains of Mesopotamia, where the Babylonians, under the shadow of ziggurats and temples, began to shape the world, not just with empires, but with clay tablets. One such tablet, a small, fragile, barely 6 inches across, sits now in the British Museum. It is called the Imago Mundi, the image of the world, and though crude by modern standards, it is revolutionary. At its center, Babylon, a rectangle in the heart of a circular landmass. The Euphrates River cuts through it like a divine scar. Around it, cities, mountains, regions. Beyond, a ring of water, and then more rings. Triangular islands labeled with names, like where a winged bird disappears, or land of the rising sun. There are no coastlines, no latitudes, no scale, but there is order. A cosmos shaped by belief. To the Babylonians, the world wasn't just a place. It was a cosmic stage, and they were at the center. Their gods walked the rivers, their fate was written in the stars. And their maps, they weren't for travelers. They were for priests, for omens, for understanding the will of the heavens, because in Babylon, geography and theology were one. And every line on the tablet said, we are not lost, we are chosen. Now, follow the Nile, down into Egypt, where another people mapped not the stars, but the earth itself. Every year, the great river flooded, washing away boundaries, erasing property lines, turning farmland into chaos. So the Egyptians answered with rope and reason. Surveyors harped on uptie, rope stretchers, measured fields with cords knotted at precise intervals. They redrew borders, restored order, and recorded it all on papyrus. One of the oldest surviving examples, the Turin papyrus map, not a worldview, not a myth, a mining chart. Drawn around 1160 BCE, it shows what is, hills, gold-bearing regions, quarries, roads, even annotations in hieratic script noting distances and mineral types. This was practical cartography, born from bureaucracy, from empire, but also from math, balance, harmony, cosmic order. Temples aligned with solstices, pyramids oriented to stars, cities laid out with sacred geometry, and in religious texts, maps of the afterlife, the Amduat, guiding the soul through 12 hours of night, past serpents, gates, and gods. Here, maps were both land survey and spiritual guide, tools of power, and portals to eternity. Because in Egypt, to map the land was to align with the gods, to impose meaning on the flood, to say, even in chaos, there is structure. Now, step into the sunlight of ancient Greece, where philosophy met measurement. Where myths gave way to mathematics, the Greeks didn't invent maps, but they transformed them, from stories into science. Enter Anaximander, 6th century BCE, philosopher, scientist, dreamer. He draws one of the first known conceptual maps of the world, a circular disk, land masses floating in an encircling ocean, no longer centered on a city, but on an idea. Then comes Hecataeus, who walks the earth, records peoples, customs, coasts. His map is paired with words, a periplus, a journey described. But the true revolution, Claudius Ptolemy, 2nd century CE, in Alexandria, he compiles Geographia, a masterpiece of ancient science. Over 8,000 locations, latitude and longitude, grids, projections, a system to represent a round Earth on flat surfaces, and Eratosthenes, centuries earlier, uses shadows, a stick, and geometry to calculate the Earth's circumference, within 1% of modern measurements. No satellites, no telescopes, just logic. The Greeks didn't just map the world. They measured it. They asked, what shape is the Earth? How big is it? Where do we stand in the cosmos? And in doing so, they turned cartography into a pursuit of truth. Not just location, but understanding. Now, shift to Rome, where maps weren't made for scholars. They were made for soldiers, for tax collectors, for emperors who needed to control an empire that stretched from Britain to the deserts of Arabia. The Romans didn't care if the earth was round, they cared if the roads were clear. And so, they created the Tabula Peutingeria, a 4th century copy of a much older Roman road map, long, narrow, stretched like a subway schematic. Land masses distorted, distances exaggerated. But one thing perfect, routes. Mile markers, way stations, rest stops, harsh changes. All laid out so a messenger, a legion, a merchant could move across the empire with precision. All roads lead to Rome wasn't poetry, it was policy, and cadastral maps, land surveys, were engraved in bronze, posted in public squares. Who owns what? Where the borders lie, because in Rome, power flowed from possession. Control the land, tax the people, move the armies. Efficiency was everything, and so, Roman maps sacrificed beauty for function. They weren't celestial, they weren't philosophical. They were logistical, practical, ruthlessly effective, a map as a spreadsheet, as a weapon. As the nervous system of an empire. Now, sail east. To the silk-wrapped courts of ancient China, where maps were not just tools, they were symbols of power. Buried in tombs, painted on silk, etched in stone. One of the earliest, from the Mongwi tomb, 2nd century BCE, shows rivers, roads, military garrisons, not to scale, but rich with detail. Governance required knowledge, and knowledge required maps. By the Han dynasty, officials used coordinate grids, centuries before Europe. And Peizu, 3rd century CE, established principles of scale, direction, and consistency. He became known as the father of Chinese cartography. But in China, mapping went beyond land. It reached for the heavens, star charts, celestial palaces, the azure dragon. The white tiger, the emperor, son of heaven, ruled only as long as his realm reflected cosmic harmony. A misaligned map, a bad omen, a sign of failing virtue. So maps were bridges between earth and sky, between order and chaos, between man and the mandate of heaven. To map was not just to navigate, it was to rule, to maintain balance, to prove you belonged in the center of the world. Now, leave the continents behind and drift into the endless blue. To the Polynesians, master navigators, wayfinders, sailors who crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, with no instruments, no written language, no metal, yet they found tiny islands in the vast Pacific. How? With stick charts, not maps you look at, maps you feel. Made of coconut fronds lashed together, shells marking islands, curved sticks representing ocean swells, wave refraction, interference patterns, knowledge passed down through generations. Apprentices memorized these charts, then burned them, because the real map lived in the mind, in the rhythm of the sea, in the flight of birds, in the color of the sky. There were types, rebellion, 4 whole archipelagos, meadow, 4 specific voyages, matang, abstract teaching tools. These weren't geographic. They were ecological, tactile, experiential. A Polynesian navigator didn't read the ocean. He listened to it, felt it in his bones, and in doing so, proved that not all maps need to be seen. Some must be lived, remembered, passed on like a song. Finally, enter the medieval world, where maps turn inward, not to measure the earth, but to reflect the soul. The TO map dominates. A circle, the O, divided by a T, 3 continents, Asia, Europe, Africa, Jerusalem at the center, East at the top, because that's where Eden lies. And beyond the edges, here be dragons, monstrous races, dog-headed men, people with feet like umbrellas. The further from God, the stranger the world becomes. These aren't navigation tools. They're theological diagrams, cosmic diagrams. They tell a story. The world is small, sacred, centered on faith, but not all medieval maps were symbolic. In 12th century Sicily, Olidrisi creates the Tabula Rogeriana, a massive silver disc map based on reports from traders, sailors, pilgrims, detailed, accurate, south at the top, commissioned by a Norman king, built on Islamic scholarship. And across traditions, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, maps show Mount Meru as the axis of the universe. Divine realms, spiritual geographies, because in the medieval mind, the world wasn't just physical. It was metaphysical, and every map asked not just where am I, but what does this mean? So what ties all these maps together? Not accuracy, not technology, but intention. The Babylonian map says, we are at the center of creation. The Egyptian, we restore order from chaos. The Greek, we can measure the earth. The Roman, we can conquer it. The Chinese, we rule in harmony with heaven. The Polynesian, we belong to the sea. The medieval, we are part of a divine plan. Each map is a mirror, reflecting what a culture values, what it fears, what it believes, and today. We have satellites, GPS, digital maps that update in real time. We can see every street, every tree, every rooftop. But the core impulse remains the same. We map to orient ourselves, to answer that ancient question, where am I? Not just in space, but in time, in story, in the grand, fragile web of human existence. Because a map is never just lines on a surface. It is a declaration that we are here, that we remember, that we are trying, always, to find our way.